Good morning. Nice to see everybody back again. I hope you are enjoying the videos on World War II. This particular video is going to focus on another set of turning points. The last video was about the war in the Pacific and island hopping. This particular video is going to be about two different turning points in World War II in Europe. The first one's going to be the Battle of Stalingrad. So if you remember from a couple videos ago, in June the 22nd of 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of the Soviet Union after he had failed to defeat the British in the Battle of Britain. He decided to invade the Soviet Union. And of course, remember that this invasion was a three-pronged attack on three of the different major cities in the Soviet Union. Leningrad to the north, where of course we talked about before, the siege that lasts over a year. Moscow, where the government and Stalin are located, and then the southern route, which of course is directed at trying to get oil for the Third Reich. Now, we're actually going to focus on that southern route first today because that becomes a major turning point. If we look at this map shows us in 1940 through 1941 the greatest extent of German control, of Nazi control over Europe itself. And of course, if you look at the Russian side, you can see those three major cities that the Germans are trying so hard to capture. Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the middle, and Stalingrad in the south. And Stalingrad is the only thing standing between them and that Caspian Sea oil that Hitler needs to run his war machine. Now, Stalingrad actually exists on a river, and so the city is split into two pieces on either side of the river, and it's also, of course, named after Joseph Stalin himself. And we already should know from what we've done in class together in these videos that Stalin is not a person who is afraid to lose an awful lot of people to get what he wants, to get his way. If you'll remember things like the Holodomor, right, the Ukrainian famine, disappearing his political enemies, Stalin is a very aggressive and violent guy. And so when it comes to losing the city that is named after him, he is willing to do whatever is necessary. On July the 17th of 1942, the German army entered the city of Stalingrad. It starts with a massive bombardment by the Luftwaffe, by the German Air Force. They just level the city. And then the army moves in and starts fighting house to house. And sometimes it turns into hand-to-hand combat. And it really is an immensely destructive battle. This is still one of the most destructive and costly battles in the entire history of the human race. In total, the estimates from both sides are somewhere around 2 million people died just in the Battle of Stalingrad because both sides are throwing absolutely everything that they've got into winning the Battle of Stalingrad. Hitler wants the oil, Stalin doesn't want him to have the oil, and also doesn't want to lose the city that is named after him. In November of 1942, so we're talking about, 4 months later, in November of 1942, the Red Army, the Soviet Union, launched a counteroffensive and actually surrounded the German 6th Army inside of the city of Stalingrad and basically just started to starve them into submission so that the German 6th Army is going to have to surrender, which eventually they're going to do. In February of 1943, the 6th Army of Nazi Germany surrenders to the Red Army, and Stalingrad is reconquered for the Soviet Union. Now, what this does, and the reason that this is a really important turning point, is this starts the long march of the Red Army from Stalingrad in the east west. Always west. They're moving in on Berlin. They're moving in on Germany. So we can see the kind of way it works here, right? It's not a nice, smooth, easy transition, but always this Eastern Front in World War II is moving further and further and further west from 1943 through 1944, all the way into 1945. The Red Army is getting closer and closer and closer to Germany, and Germany is throwing everything they can into this battle. Soviet Union's throwing everything they can into this battle. It's a hugely destructive thing, and the estimated casualties from the Soviet side in World War II are somewhere around 20 million people. And the problem with counting Soviet statistics of death is that it always comes down to millions and millions and millions of people. Now, Stalin's okay with taking millions of casualties, but he would really like to accelerate the process of ending the war. And so he goes to his allies in the United States and Britain and says to them, listen, is it possible for us to open up a second front to divide German forces so that we can accelerate the end of this particular war? And so that takes us to the next really big turning point, right? As the Eastern Front is moving closer and closer to Germany, we've got to open up a second front against the Axis. That second front came in August of 1942 when the German army was moving across northern Africa. Originally, the Italians were fighting in North Africa, but the Italian army really was defeated by the British, who were trying desperately to protect their control of the Suez Canal. And so eventually what happens is that the Germans take control of North Africa from the Italians using an army called the Afrika Korps under the command of one of their greatest generals, whose name was Erwin Rommel. Now, Rommel is super important because he really was a military genius, and they called him the Desert Fox because he would pop up out of nowhere and attack and then run away and hide, and he was a very, very difficult commander to try to defeat. But in August of 1942, the British commander, who was also a genius, whose name was Field Marshal Montgomery, put together a plan to defeat Rommel's Afrika Korps in a battle called El Alamein. And you can see the battle labeled there on the lower right-hand corner of this particular map, El Alamein, which in August of 1942 becomes another major turning point in World War II, because from El Alamein, Montgomery defeats Rommel, and the British army starts to advance and to drive the Afrika Korps out of northern Africa. Now, in the meantime, of course, by the time we get to 1942, the American army has been trained, it's been equipped, it's really getting itself in, an organized way. And so in November of 1942, at the same time that Montgomery is driving west across northern Africa, the American army lands in the western part of North Africa and starts driving east to support the British. So basically, we've got the German army surrounded, and we're pushing them further and further and further towards the Mediterranean Sea, up to the point where we get to May of 1943, when the German army has to abandon North Africa. Now, when they abandon northern Africa, Stalin again says, I want another front. I want you to spread the enemy as thin as you possibly can be. So the question became, where do we go from here? Should we invade Greece? Should we invade southern France? Where are we going to go? Are we going to go after Italy? The decision was made that they were going to attack Italy and try to knock Italy out of the war as one of those three members of the Axis powers, right? The Axis powers are Japan, Germany, and Italy. And they said, if we can knock Italy out of the war, it makes things a lot better for us because that's one less country we have to fight. June the 9th of 1943, the Allies land in Sicily, in the small island on the southern end of Italy itself, and they start driving north to capture that German army holding on to Sicily, right? So far in the European theater, what we've gotten is El Alamein, the American landings in the west, driving across North Africa, and then making that jump into Sicily. And eventually what happens is, from Sicily, which we do capture, we then start moving up the boot of Italy in 1943 and then 1944. By the time we get to 1944, Mussolini is getting very panicked that he's losing the war, and it was actually the king, Victor Emmanuel, the man who in the 1920s gave Mussolini the chance to form a government. The king stepped in and fired him. He dismissed Benito Mussolini. He dismissed Il Duce and said, you're out, we're forming a new government. Now, two things happened. Number one is that in September of 1943, Mussolini was actually rescued from Italy by the Germans. They took him to Germany, and the German army took control of northern Italy. When that happens, though, what's really, really interesting about it is Italy turns around and in 1944 joins the Allies. So at the very end of World War II, Italy flip-flops again, just like they did in World War I, and actually joins the Allied powers against the German army that is occupying northern Italy. Now, the great part about this is the German army is getting divided in two directions. They're fighting east against the Soviet Union. They're fighting in northern Italy against the Allies, the British and the United States, and now the Italians as well. And so World War II is accelerating, and the Axis is losing. Now, in the next video, which will be the last one about the actual fighting part of World War II, we're going to look at the third major turning point, and that's going to be the war on the Western Front and opening up yet another front in World War II. So as always, I hope you're enjoying the videos. I hope they're helping you to understand the history that we don't have a chance to study together because of the current situation that we find ourselves in. Leave a like, make sure you're subscribing so that you're getting updates and notifications on when these videos post. Leave questions, comments, concerns either here in the video itself or on the Google Classroom. Stay healthy and stay safe, everybody, and I will see you in the next video.